And our next guest this evening is Dr. Gregg Quiggle, who is joining us from Chicagoland.
Greetings.
And Gregg is the D.L. Moody Professor of Theology at the Moody Bible Institute. He's someone who is well versed in Christianity in the 19th century, particularly D.L. Moody and the revivals that he was associated with throughout North America, as well as the United Kingdom. And he's been a big influence in my own studies of church history and mixing these things with theology and service to the church. So welcome, Gregg. This portion will be slightly different than those that have preceded, because this is going to be a bit more of a two-way conversation between Gregg and I as we look at the relationship of C.H. Spurgeon and D.L. Moody and what we might take of that today, and different implications that are still echoing through church. So, Gregg, if you want to get started, we've heard quite a lot about Spurgeon over the last, I think we're on hour 14. I'm beginning to lose count. We've heard quite a lot about Spurgeon. I wonder if you could introduce us to Mr. Moody.
Absolutely. Mr. Moody is quite different in terms of background than Mr. Spurgeon or Reverend Spurgeon, which is part of the reason their friendship is so interesting. Mr. Moody was born in 1837. He was one of 9. He was the 7th of 9 kids. His family was not Christian. His father, many people believe, was probably an alcoholic. His father died when Dwight was 4 years old. His mother was 8 months pregnant with twins. Wow. And they were so far in debt that the debt collectors came. He died in the afternoon, his father. And by that evening, they had stripped almost everything out of the house. They were able to save his dad's bricklaying tools by hiding them in the attic.
Wow.
So very poor, virtually 5 years of formal education, and that might be winking a bit. So the way I like to illustrate this to people is try to explain to them how Mr. Moody wrote and spelled things. So he writes a letter home when he's a 17-year-old. He's in Boston, and he writes home, and he's writing to his brother George, and he's trying to write somewhere the psalmist says. But here's what he writes: somewhere the samest, S-A-I-M-E-S-T, that's psalmist,
right,
says S-A-I-S.
Right.
So very little training. By today's standards, we would call him attention disorder with hyperactivity. He was constantly in trouble. Didn't read a ton. Grass didn't grow under Mr. Moody's feet. He has a conversion experience, and he's really on fire for the Lord and wants to work with especially people that are outside the margins, and starts inviting street kids. We would call them slum kids from Chicago. He ends up moving to Chicago. He's born in rural Massachusetts, to church, and they don't have a clue about how to behave in church. So
and this is the days of renting pews, is that right?
Yeah. He's renting pews and bringing them in, and at some point they suggest that's probably not a good idea. So he rents a saloon and cleans it out himself because he doesn't want anybody else working on the Sabbath, and starts having Sunday schools. And this thing becomes so popular that by 1860, Abraham Lincoln, when he is inaugurated, when he's on his way to Washington, D.C. for the inauguration, stops to visit. There's over 1,000 of these street kids.
Wow.
By the time Mr. Moody is dead, he's preached by some estimates to somewhere around 100 million people. He not only did evangelism in the model that we're used to, big meetings, that sort of stuff, but he also started 5 schools, which is really remarkable given his lack of education. He knew how important education was. He used to pray and say publicly, Lord, I don't have any education, but I want to do something for you. And I'm doing the best I can. Never ordained. He got very angry, actually called him Reverend. No, I'm Mr. Moody, a layman from Chicago. Very aggressive. Starts Moody Bible Institute, where I work and where you went to school.
That's right.
Also started a Bible college in Glasgow, Scotland. Unfortunately, it's gone now. Glasgow Bible College, and then it was International Christian College, and it's closed, I believe, in the last decade.
Yeah, that's right.
He was involved in Carruthers Close up at Edinburgh, which is a church up there. In addition to which, he started 2 schools in Massachusetts that are designed to prepare people for college. All of his schools were geared towards poor people to prepare them for ministry. And that's where Spurgeon comes in. After Moody becomes a believer, he hears about Charles Spurgeon. And one biographer of Moody says Spurgeon was his hero. In fact, Moody actually writes to Spurgeon in 1881, and he says, I have for years thought more of you than any other man preaching on the earth. Wow. And another time he writes, everything I can get a hold of in print that he ever said, I read. Now that's interesting because this is a guy that's not given to reading. So who does he read? He reads Spurgeon. He goes to the UK for the first time in 1867. First place he goes, Metropolitan Tabernacle. And he talks about getting in there and just sitting in the balcony and sort of, he calls it just drinking it in. And he spent time with Spurgeon during that time. And he said, I went back to America a better man. And you've heard from multiple people how busy Spurgeon was. Yeah. He cleaned out his schedule to spend 4 days with Dwight Moody at this first trip.
That's extraordinary.
It really is extraordinary. And just another thing here, there's a letter here from Moody in 1874 to Spurgeon. Spurgeon asked him to come to preach at the tabernacle. And Moody writes back, in regards to coming to your tabernacle, I consider it a great honor to be invited. In fact, I should consider it an honor to black your boots, which kind of explains how Moody thought about Charles Spurgeon. And when you look at Moody at the end of his life, large portions of what he did can be traced back to Charles Spurgeon. In many ways, the school that I work at is modeled off the school that you worked at. Moody came to Spurgeon's College and examined what they were doing there to prepare people for ministry. Moody became, whenever Moody was a premillennialist, and when anybody would say, why are you a premillennialist? He would always say, because Spurgeon is. I mean, he always cited Spurgeon to back that up. And the other thing he got from Spurgeon is concern for the poor, practical work for the poor that we see in Dwight Moody that is traceable to really listening to Spurgeon. Now, a lot of that's his own experience. He knew what poverty was. Sure. But that piece of seeing the gospel, he'd go out with Spurgeon, and you know the story, Tom, where Spurgeon would take his Bible and fill his pocket with money and bang on doors. And if they needed the gospel, he'd tell them the gospel. And if they needed food, he'd give them money. And that's part of Moody's DNA. And I think there's connections there. So it's clear that Dwight Moody just absolutely adored Spurgeon. And again, how remarkable their backgrounds are. Spurgeon said once, we were talking about this earlier, again, Moody is probably hyperactive. Spurgeon said, Dwight Moody is the only man I know who can say Mesopotamia in 2 syllables. He didn't even say Daniel. He said Daniel. He spoke at an outrageously high rate, 250 words a minute. I mean, how different is this from Charles Spurgeon? It's just remarkable. And to kind of flip that, I'd like to talk a little bit about how Spurgeon talked about Moody, so you can see how their relationship worked.
Gregg, if I could just ask really quick.
Sure.
You've been reading a bit from Mr. Moody and Spurgeon. Can you just elaborate a little bit on those sources? Because we're hearing some stuff that, if I understand correctly, has not been shared publicly before.
Some of this comes from other places, but if you are interested in Mr. Moody, and there are letters of Spurgeon to Moody in this collection, all you need to do is go online to Moody Center, MOODYCENTER. Sorry, it's American spelling. moodycenter.org. And there are archives that are available to the public. All of Moody's letters, sermon outlines, you can see them in the original, and they are transcribed, which in Moody's case, besides his spelling, his handwriting is unbelievable.
Sounds like a real gift.
Yes. And they're free. Anybody that wants to can read any of these. You just go there. All they ask for is, I believe, an email address. They're not going to ask you for money, or they're not going to demand money. They may ask you for money, but this is a real important resource for people who are interested in Spurgeon and how his ministry works in the U.S. And I think the guy that carries it is Dwight Moody. So if I can just read a couple things here, sure. Here's a comment from Spurgeon on Mr. Moody. He says, I want you now to hear a moment while I say the brother who is about to speak, Mr. Moody, is one whom we all love. He is one whom we all not only all love, but he is evidently one whom God loves. We feel devotedly grateful to Almighty God for raising him up and for sending him to England to preach the gospel to such great numbers with plainness and power. I believe this was in the 1870s. Moody's first crusade in London, he spoke to over 2 million people, just to give you a framework. We shall continue to pray for him when he has gone home. Among the things we shall pray for will be that he may come back again. I might quote the language of an old Scotch song with regard to Prince Charlie. Bonnie Moody's gone away, will ye no come back again? Better love ye canna be, will ye no come back again? My Scottish accent is lacks. But that just gives you a piece. I've got a couple things here. When Moody died, or when Mr. Spurgeon died, Reverend Spurgeon died, Mrs. Spurgeon sent a copy of Spurgeon's Bible to Moody. And she writes in this, Mr. D.L. Moody from Mrs. C.H. Spurgeon. In tender memory of the beloved one gone home to God, this Bible has been used by my precious husband and is now given with unfeigned pleasure to one in whose hands its blessed service will be continued and extended. And in fact, Mrs. Spurgeon sent Moody 2 Bibles. In addition to his pulpit Bible, she also sent him a copy of Spurgeon's study Bible. And William Moody, in his biography of his father, Dwight, wrote that every time after he got it, Mr. Moody prepared a sermon. he would always check that Bible first to see if Spurgeon had preached on that text. And if he had, Moody would always go to his collection of Spurgeon sermons and look it up. So you can see there's a remarkable friendship here that is, again, makes no sense from a human perspective, but they were kindred souls. They had a deep love for the Bible, a deep love for the lost, a burden for the poor. They wanted to see people give their lives in ministry. It's kind of a remarkable thing.
Wonder if I can ask,
sure,
just quickly. So when we're talking about preaching, we've been hearing lots of sermons, and to our ears today, Spurgeon seems very eloquent, erudite, maybe a bit flowery at times. He's a romantic, and yet in his own day, there were certainly corridors of Victorian society that said, well, he's just very plain-spoken and common. I think George Eliot said it was a grocer's back parlor view of Calvinism, these sorts of things. So if that was the reception of Spurgeon, I wonder if you might just talk about how Moody was received in Britain.
Well, initially they were appalled. First off, he had a New England accent. And second, he spoke very fast. He clipped words. And third, he was very direct. I mean, there's one meeting where I forget Shaftesbury or somebody is being announced as Lord something or other, and he stands up and says, "We don't have any need for that stuff. I'm plain old white Moody from Chicago. You don't owe me anything. I'm just a layman. Now, here's what the Bible says." Boom. And he was famous too. There's the old preaching mantra: stand up, speak up, shut up. Moody's sermons were short, and he wouldn't tolerate long-windedness. There was one time at a meeting where a guy was praying, and he was praying too long. So Moody just stood up while the guy's praying and said, "Open your hymn books, and as our brother finishes, we'll start getting him number." Queen Victoria said, "His type of religion is not for me."
Very diplomatic.
Very diplomatic. But he was embraced by elements of Anglicanism. There were parts of the Church of England, and of course the nonconformists. And the other piece that's just strange is he was welcomed in Dublin, which the Catholics accepted him, because there was no guile in this man. When you read the accounts, what they talk about that comes through every time is his earnestness. He goes to Oxford and Cambridge, and the students come to laugh at him because he sounds like a hayseed. But he wins them over with his earnestness. And my sense is, just you see the same thing in Mr. Spurgeon, that okay, there's flowery, but underneath this, here is this heart of this man that is compelling. And I think Moody and Spurgeon knew that about each other, and they fed off each other that way, even though they were so different stylistically, but they functioned that way as sort of kindred souls.
Just one more question I had. You said over 2 million people came to London to see Mr. Moody, and Spurgeon publishes millions of sermons throughout his time in a variety of languages. Could you just say something broadly to the popularity of preachers in the 19th century, just to give people who might not be familiar with the era a sense of how well known these guys would be?
Yes. So you have to remember there is no media. So
there's no Netflix.
Yeah, there's no Netflix, there's no television, there's no radio. So you have newspapers, but then the importance of the spoken word and the power of the spoken word, and especially those preachers that were extraordinarily gifted, and ways guys like Spurgeon multiplied themselves is, who knows how many country preachers functionally were just re-preaching Spurgeon's sermons because they, that's all they had. And the same with Mr. Moody. The same sort of thing, but the power of the spoken word, their ability to draw large numbers, and in Moody's case, the novelty of it all. He had a man that sang with him named Ira Sankey, and again, not a professional singer, but a lovely baritone voice, and especially working people. And another piece relative to that, Tom, is they did a hymnal, the Moody Sankey hymnal. You will still find them. I think they sold 50 million of these things. They're still all over the place in houses in Britain, especially rural. You get out, and I've been traveling around and met people. What do you do? Moody Bible Institute. Oh, of Moody Sankey. Yeah. And older folks will say, I remember spending Sunday night or Saturday night around the piano singing out of the Moody Sankey hymn book. So preachers and hymns that were family entertainment. That's how it worked. I'd like to read a couple of these letters from Spurgeon to Moody to just, give you a sense of how they thought about each other. These are kind of interesting. So this one is from 1884. Dear friend, you said you'd be present at my Jubilee, did you not? It draws near. On the 18th is to be a meeting for our poor members and all of our home friends and workers, etc. Will you come and make a short speech at that? On the 19th, Thursday, is the actual birthday. Then other great folks will come and Shaftesbury will be in the chair. Will you come then? Whichever you please only let me know. Mrs. Spurgeon and I have the sermons, 29 volumes, and the treasury books bound for you. And we are going to give them to you when you come for them. So if you come for dinner on the 19th, we would like to give them to you. And he ends it this way. Now, O King of men, answer, your sovereign will speedily and oblige, which is this sort of stuff. But you hear this sort of thing. I was trying to find, there's one or two other one here. Dear friend, to my great regret, I found that I am published to preach on Friday evening. The week is full of one missionary and other meetings, and I am unable to steal away or would gladly do so. I enclose letter for prayers just received. The Lord is with thee, thou mighty men of valor. Yours heartily, C.H. Spurgeon. And there's just numbers of these that have this sort of, well, here's the last one to Mrs. Moody. You know we should be glad to see your husband at any time of the day or night. We should prefer him to come on Saturday after dinner, say 3 or 4, and bring his wife with him. If he came and have settled to come early, then we would have prepared him a dinner. But as he does not settle for that, there will be no time for preparing. And if he comes before dinner, he must share our potatoes and salt with possibly a bit of butter. The books are here all ready for the beloved man. Mrs. Spurgeon wants me to press the matter about your coming. So I do. The Lord bless you both. Yours heartily, C.H. Spurgeon.
That's great.
Wonderful letters.
Yeah, you get sort of this inside look at the life and correspondence of friends.
Yes.
It's really a fascinating window. Gregg, we've got about 5 minutes left by my clock, and I wondered if I might just ask you, you spoke earlier about the connection, the sort of shared DNA of Spurgeon's College, or the Pastor's College as it was known then, and the Moody Bible Institute. As I recall, both institutions that were not supposed to be named after their founders, but somehow ended up that way. I wonder if you might just talk about the sort of shared DNA of those two places, maybe compared to other theological instruction of the century.
Well, I obviously know more about the one that I work at than the one that you do, but a shared commitment to practical ministry. And that is, rather than commitment to, I guess we would say, academics today. And the operative word here is training. The training is designed to prepare people to be effective pastors. And there's a sense, at least in Moody's mind, and you can say whether or not it was for Spurgeon, but in Moody's mind, he believed that seminaries were no longer preparing people to work with working class people. So to put it in an English context, Dwight Moody is a Wesley throwback.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've got a quote here from Spurgeon just on that point. He's talking about in the Trowel, his view of the college, and he says the students there are not to be warped into philosophers, polished into debaters, carved into metaphysicians, fashioned into literati, or even sharpened into critics. They're to be thoroughly furnished unto every good work. He says the scriptures must be their chief class book, theology their main science, and the art of teaching their practical study. And so, yeah, it's just this, he's not saying we're not going to tackle tough things, but there's an end to it.
And the end, I think, for both of them is much more geared towards the common person. And so, Moody, Moody, the famous line is "Gap men," that that the seminaries have educated pastors away from working people, and we need to educate a group of men and women that can go between the churches and working people and do evangelism and discipleship in the working class communities. Again, it's Wesley-esque. It's really a continuation of that sort of thing. But also, people forget this about Moody Bible Institute. If you look at the early catalogs, it also says, not just gap men, but men called to ministry too late in life go through the college seminary thing. And it also says for people who have seminary degrees, but want more practical training. So my read of Spurgeon's College is that's a lot of what Spurgeon is trying to do. He's trying to say, we got great theological universities in this country. What we need is some practical training, working knowledge of the English Bible. That's what you hear echoed out of both schools. Evangelism, discipleship, practical work is what Moody would call it. I think he saw that at Spurgeon's.
That's really helpful. Now we're still waiting for our next speaker to come into the waiting room. So I wonder if there's anything else on Mr. Moody that you think might be helpful as we've thought about preaching and education, and maybe if we circle back just briefly to the sort of activism of Moody.
I think both Spurgeon and Moody represent a practical activism that comes from a really simple reading of the Bible. If your neighbor is hungry, feed him. Why would you even have questions about that? Christianity for both of them is, on one level, exceedingly simple. You must address the needs of poor people because that's what the Bible says you do. I was trying to see if I can try to find this thing back here. Moody observed Spurgeon's commitment to the Bible in the way Spurgeon sought personally to apply its teachings about the poor. And it's that, it's the same sort of thing with both of them. I'm not going to argue an economic theory. I'm going to go fill my pockets with change and make sure that the guy down the street has something to eat tonight. It's very practical. In Moody's case, it comes out of his work with something called the YMCA, which actually started in Great Britain. And when Moody is doing the Sunday school, he's also doing the YMCA, and he writes one of those famous misspelling letters home where he says, I'm plumb wore out, because he got a donkey, and he has like 50 families that he brings them firewood or coal and food every week. And, this is a kid. He's in his 20s at this point. And he doesn't have a bucket load of money. He's sleeping in the Y.
Wow.
So is your next guest here?
Not just yet.
Okay, well, now I'll just keep rambling. So, that he started that himself, Tom, but that would have been reinforced when he came in 1867 and watched Reverend Spurgeon do what he did when he would walk around the neighborhood. You know better than I do. What was it? One day a week he would just do door to door.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so he's poised in Southwark in this working class neighborhood, Elephant and Castle, and these sorts of areas whereby the people who have no safety net live there. And so he's reaching out to people who are working incredibly long, dangerous shifts in the peak of the industrial era. And London is the middle of it, and he's right in the heart of London. So
it's the same.
No shortage of opportunity.
Yeah, it's the same with Moody. He goes, in fact, they called him Crazy Moody because he went into the part of Chicago where even the police didn't go. And one of the most poignant stories, and it gets used in ways that, it shouldn't, but there's a guy that hears about Moody's Sunday school. And so he decides to go to see this, and he gets there and it's dark. And he sees Mr. Moody sitting on steps outside the saloon, candles, and he's got a little African-American boy on his lap. And he's trying to read to him from the Gospel of John. And he's so limited in his literacy that he can't even read all the words. He's skipping words. And the guy watches this and he goes, man, this is remarkable. And this is one of the first times that Moody, talks to him afterwards, and he says, I ain't got no education, but I love Jesus, and I want to try to do something for him. And both of them express that commitment, but they come from such radically different places. In Spurgeon, it's this literate home, but there's this burden that separates him from other educated ministers. It's remarkable.
Well, it's interesting. As we're kind of wading into the grass here, I wonder, so Spurgeon, we've talked about, and several of the pieces that have been read have talked about Spurgeon and suffering, Spurgeon and depression, these kind of things. And so Spurgeon, sort of famously has this tragedy happen when he's rather young, in his low 20s. Some people decide to pull a prank in an overcrammed lecture theater where they had rented space, and someone calls that there's a fire, and there's a stampede that leaves several people dead and dozens with sort of lifelong impacting injury. And Spurgeon, as you read letters and if you get into more of his story, realize that in the wake of this really just profound tragedy, he experiences depression, probably on and off for the rest of his ministry. And I know that Moody has a bit of a turbulent life as well. I wonder if things like the Chicago fire and different upsets that happen in his own life, change, how he approaches these things.
Yeah, it does. He has a problem with conflict. And I think it goes back to losing his father. He is marked by his lack of education. I mean, he's very aware of that. He marries actually a woman from London that's educated, and she really helps him. You can see his handwriting improve, his spelling improve. And so there's those pieces. The thing that I think people don't know about Mr. Moody that I think shaped him a ton is his involvement in the American Civil War. He was at the front 9 times. And I don't think people in the United States, let alone outside of the United States, understand the brutality of that war. If using the same amount of population as if I forget, the population of the United States was something like 29 million at that point, and the casualties were somewhere around, deaths, not wounded, deaths were around 800,000.
Wow. So
that'd be something like 8 or 9 million today. And, can you imagine where, for a while, the state of Alabama's the largest expenditure in the state budget was artificial limbs. And so Moody is on the front of this thing. He's at Shiloh, which is just an unbelievable thing. And he goes out with the YMCA under something called the U.S. Christian Commission. And they got a bucket, they got a blanket they put around him, a Bible, and a hymn book. And his job was to minister to the men, help them write letters home, et cetera, et cetera. But it was also his job to help bury the dead and be with the men as they were dying. He doesn't talk about it much, but I don't know how you cannot be exposed to that amount of slaughter. It's just an awful thing that they didn't understand the technology. They shot bullets that were large lead things. So when you got hit, they just take out big pieces of your bone. It was an awful thing. And I think that's part of the reason he crashes shortly after the Civil War. In fact, that's why he goes to England in 1867. He needs a break. And I think it was at least as much for his mental health as anything else. And then the Chicago fire, he lost everything. The church, their home. The only thing they saved out of the home was a painting. Wow. Just remarkable loss. And like the Great London Fire, 20% of the city burned down. In Chicago, people don't realize, but London was a metropolis, but London had kind of been a metropolis kind of for a long time. In 1837, the year Moody is born, Chicago consists of like 19 buildings.
It's crazy to think of.
By 1900, so what is that, 60 whatever years? By 1900, it has a population of 1.9 million. It's the 5th largest city in the world. It does that in 63 years or whatever. And in the middle of that, 20% of it burned down. So
that's staggering.
Yeah, I mean, the stories of typhoid, all kinds of stuff that goes through. And that's another thing that he shared with Spurgeon, this very in your face. They were connected directly. They saw this mess. Moody saw the mess in his own family. You know, his dad was probably an alcoholic. He knew what poverty was. He lived most of his life away from the home. His mother had to rent him out to other families in the summer. He'd walk 10 miles to the next town and work for other families that didn't have boys. The Civil War, and then you have this sort of mess with urban stuff. And I think both of them were shaped by those sorts of tragedies.
Yeah, I think it gives us some context for these influential ministries that are really associated with profound suffering at the same time. It's easy to sing the sort of respective praises of these eras and these sorts of things, and then forget that, you know, the public health situations, the realities of economics at the time, these kind of things. It was for the people that Moody and Spurgeon were seeking to serve. You know, this is a really scary time in many respects.
Yeah, and part of the reason, I mean, I happened to do my thesis on how Moody understood urban social ills. And I think, again, part of the reason he's drawn to Spurgeon is here is another man who is effectively ministering in the context of an urban mess. You know, Elephant and Castle wasn't exactly a posh town. And he was able to see how this man was able to build effective ministries and the kind of training that he came to the conclusion that people needed to do these kinds of ministries. And I think he absorbed a lot of that.
So one of the things that I always find interesting is looking into the stories of some of the students of Spurgeon's college in the early years. And so you have these characters. Spurgeon wasn't just training Baptists, so there were primitive Methodists who were coming to the college. And I think one of the most interesting stories to me is a gentleman called Thomas L. Johnson, who was a freed slave who had a passion to go to Africa as a missionary and was rejected by all of the seminaries and mission organizations in the United States. And he's so undeterred, he sails across to England and meets with the Baptist Missionary Society. We've had some folks from them on earlier today, and he meets with the BMS. They send him to Alexander McLaren, who says, okay, go see Spurgeon. And so Spurgeon is quite happy to meet with him, takes him onto the college. And actually in Johnson's memoirs, you have, you know, a really vivid account of what it was like to be a student at the college in the day. And he's someone who's coming in with, you know, the obvious limitations in terms of his previous education opportunities and these kind of things. And it's a testimony to not just a vision, but a lecturing team who are quite keen to empower and equip people beyond sort of read this systematic theology.
Yeah.
And I just found it fascinating to follow. You can follow Thomas Johnson through his story as he studies at the pastor's college and as he sets sail for West Africa and these sorts of things. And so I wonder, in the early days of Mr. Moody's training, you've said he established training facilities in Glasgow and in New England and Chicago. Is there anything similar in terms of, I guess we might call it access and participation
Yes.
for people? How does Moody tackle that?
Yeah, Moody's a mixed bag on that. One of the, people are flawed. I tell students one of the mistakes is we read some of these figures from church history and we turn them into Jesus Jr. And then we're disappointed when their feet are made of massive amounts of clay. Part of the reason I like some of these people so much is because they're so deeply flawed. But in Moody's case, he is profoundly committed to abolitionism. In fact, he takes part in a riot in Boston that's it's involved a slave, long story. But, and so when his schools are opened, well, the first school he does is for poor girls. He's riding around out in Northfield, which is in western Massachusetts, out in the boonies. And he and his brother are riding up in the hills and they come across this little cabin and there's a family there. The father had been handicapped somehow, injured or something, but he had a college education. He had gone to Oberlin, which was Charles Finney's school. And
stomping grounds.
Yeah. And there were two girls that were making straw hats, plaiting straw hats, and they stopped and talked to him, and they were one of the main sources of income for the family, these straw hats. And Moody gets in his wagon and starts riding away, and he looks at his brother and he says, those are really smart young girls and they'll never, ever get a chance to go to school. We got to do something about that. So he starts this school called Northfield Seminary for Young Women, which is what we would today call college prep. Okay. But you couldn't go there unless you were poor. It literally says rich people are not welcome. And the other thing he does is when he starts this thing, he finds a woman and he says, I want you to go to Oklahoma. I want you to find 12 Native American girls that are smart and that can go back to their people and help educate them. Bring them here. And she wires back and says, I found 16. And he said, bring them. And so when you look at the early classes, it's children of slaves. There's Chinese students. There's Native Americans. And most of the Caucasians are none of them are upper class. A lot of them are immigrant, Irish, Polish, this sort of thing. He does the same thing a few years later with the boys on the opposite side of the river. He happens to live, for those folks that are listening that know the name Jonathan Edwards, he lived about 30 miles north of where Jonathan Edwards lived and worked. So his schools are racially mixed. He takes Catholics in, which is, and so that's all great. But here's the big black spot. After the Civil War, he goes down to Augusta, Georgia, and one of his fellow ministers has started a revival down there, a mission, a crusade, I guess we'd call them. And he gets down there and he walks in and it's segregated. And Moody just blows a fuse. I mean, these white people are going to be so surprised when these black people are marching into heaven and they're going to hell and stuff like this. And but a number of the other men on the team said, you can't do this. If you let black people sit with white people, this will blow up. And Moody bailed. And he ran segregated meetings for probably 10 or 15 years after that.
Wow.
He finally changed his mind in Texas. He went down there, the meetings were set up, and there was a segregation rail set up. And he literally got so angry, he just ran over and physically knocked it down. But by that point, among African Americans, especially in the South, he was viewed as a person who compromised. And he did. He violated his own conscience. He did violate his own conscience. And I'm sure if he had that to do over, and there was a lot, if a man of Dwight Moody's stature had paved the way on that, that would have changed, I think, American society. But, you know.
It's an interesting, we're moving slightly outside our window of history, but, you know, that made me instantly think of Billy Graham and the different way in which he approached that. And, you know, sadly, still a time in America where in certain parts of the United States, these sorts of things were still in practice.
Yeah, and just to give you a, you know, and this is to the extent that Spurgeon influenced Moody, he also influenced Billy Graham. I mean, we have letters in the archives I mentioned before. One is from Billy Graham to Moody's daughter, I think, and it says, I don't think you people understand the amount of ministry that's traceable to the work of your father. In fact, I was reading through old letters in there, and the Billy Graham Association in the 1970s, I think, wrote to the Moody family asking them about information on how they handled Mr. Moody's funeral, because they were thinking they wanted to pattern Billy Graham's. In fact, if you remember, just before Graham died, he made that statement, someday you'll hear Billy Graham is, that is a direct copy. Dwight Moody said the same thing. Someday you'll hear Dwight Moody is gone. Don't you believe a word of it. I'll be more alive then than I've ever been. That's word for word Dwight Moody. And I thought, wow. And so, you know, to the extent that there is this line, and it's not insignificant. Where does Graham go? London. And where does Moody become famous? London. And you see these connections. I don't think there's a Spurgeon for Graham like there was for Moody, but to the extent that Spurgeon drove Moody, which he clearly did, then indirectly Spurgeon is driving Graham to some extent too.
It's fascinating to see the interconnectedness and all these things. And so we have lots of students training up for ministry in London and virtually just now. But I wonder if you were to offer sort of, you know, a perspective from the U.S. and ministry education and these kind of things, you know, maybe just a word of encouragement as we start to bring these things to a close. You know, what might Mr. Moody say in regard to current ministry in cities and in the wake of sharp changes in how we go about what we do?
Well, I think he would be heartbroken to some extent by the state of Christianity, especially in London, but in the United States as well, that this great city is no longer a herald for the gospel like it had been. And Moody would want to tell the young men at Spurgeon's or older men or whoever, women that are studying there, roll up your sleeves. Ask God to do, ask God, give that good God everything that you have, and see what he does with it. He also used to tell students, I'm paraphrasing, find the thing that needs to be done that nobody else wants to do, and do that. Way too much ministry is copycat. And so I would say to the people studying at Spurgeon's, don't just do what somebody else is already doing. Find the thing that really needs to be done that nobody is doing. Find that place where God can work. For Moody, it was slum kids and renting a saloon. And there are plenty of places in a marvelous city like London, which, by the way, London is kind of my favorite city in the world. I don't get to go there very much anymore, but
we'll have to have you back.
Yeah, I miss it. And you have a marvelous heritage. I've stood on those hills in Bristol where Whitefield and Wesley preached, and I've been to Spurgeon's, and I've been to Metropolitan Tabernacle and Westminster Chapel, and ask God to breathe life into the dry bones. Remain faithful. Let's see what the Lord can do. Don't despair. Be faithful where God puts you. That's what Mr. Spurgeon did. This is where God placed me, and I'm going to be faithful to God here. I can't do everything, but I can do this. And so I would say, stay in the Word, love people, think carefully about, study your world. What in the world's going on? Find out what's going on in your neighborhood. Find out what's breaking people's hearts. Find out what people care about.
Thank you so much, Gregg. You have inadvertently taken 2 time slots. I've been greatly appreciative of your time. And
that means I get a double paycheck, right?
Well, unfortunately, twice is the same on this case.
This is a privilege to be part of this. I blessings on you.
Well, we're grateful again. We'll have quite a nice participation between Moody and Spurgeons in the next hour or so. And yeah, we're just massively appreciative of your words of encouragement as well. So thank you so much, and keep safe.
You too. Blessing.
Have a good afternoon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.